The Ed Gein Case, murderer who practiced necrophilia, a dive into Ed's intimacy in the isolated farmlands of Plainfield, Wisconsin during the 1950s. A quiet, unassuming man named Edward Theodore Gein lived a life that would forever change America's understanding of human depravity. Known to his neighbors as a harmless handyman who kept to himself, Gein harbored secrets so disturbing that when they were finally revealed, they would inspire some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema history, including Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill. The Ed Gein case represents one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing criminal investigations in American history. Unlike typical serial killers who are driven by power, control, or sexual gratification, Gein's crimes were motivated by a twisted psychological need rooted in severe maternal domination, sexual repression, and an inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality. His actions went far beyond murder, delving into necrophilia, grave robbing, and the creation of grotesque artifacts from human remains. What makes Gein's case particularly chilling is not just the nature of his crimes, but the methodical way he transformed his isolated farmhouse into a macabre workshop where he crafted household items and clothing from the bodies of his victims and corpses he had exhumed from local cemeteries. His house of horrors contained lampshades made from human faces, bowls carved from skulls, and a vest fashioned from a woman's torso, born in 1906 to a domineering mother and an alcoholic father. Gein's psychological development was warped from an early age by Augusta Gein's fanatical religious beliefs and her pathological hatred of sexuality and the female body. This toxic upbringing, combined with years of social isolation and sexual repression, created the perfect conditions for the development of one of America's most notorious criminals. Discovery of Gein's crimes in November 1957 sent shockwaves through the small community of Plainfield and captured the attention of the entire nation. The investigation revealed not only 2 confirmed murders, but also evidence of extensive grave robbing and necrophilic activities that had been ongoing for years. The case challenged law enforcement's understanding of criminal psychology and introduced America to concepts of mental illness and sexual deviance that had previously been confined to psychiatric textbooks. This case has been extensively studied by criminologists, psychologists, and forensic experts, providing crucial insights into the development of psychopathic behavior and the relationship between childhood trauma and adult criminality. Each examination of Gein's life and crimes reveals new layers of psychological complexity and raises fundamental questions about the nature of evil and the factors that can transform a human being into a monster. If you're fascinated by the darkest corners of criminal psychology and want to understand how childhood trauma can manifest in the most horrific ways, make sure to follow this channel, because Ed Gein's story is not just about murder, but about the complete breakdown of human psychology and the terrifying intimacy between life and death. The origins. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, into a family that would provide the perfect breeding ground for psychological dysfunction and criminal behavior. His father, George Philip Gein, was a weak-willed alcoholic who owned a small farm and struggled to maintain any authority within his own household. His mother, Augusta Wilhelmina Gein, was a domineering, fanatically religious woman whose twisted worldview would profoundly shape her son's psychological development and ultimately contribute to his transformation into one of America's most notorious criminals. Gein's household was ruled with an iron fist by Augusta, who viewed the world through the lens of extreme religious fundamentalism and harbored a pathological hatred of sexuality, particularly female sexuality. She believed that all women, except herself, were instruments of the devil, designed to tempt and corrupt men. This warped perspective on gender and sexuality became the foundation of Ed's understanding of human relationships and would later manifest in his grotesque crimes. Involving the female form, Augusta's parenting style was characterized by psychological abuse, religious indoctrination, and complete control over her children's social interactions. She homeschooled Ed and his older brother Henry, keeping them isolated from the outside world and filling their minds with her twisted interpretations of biblical teachings. According to Augusta's worldview, the outside world was filled with sin and corruption, and only through complete devotion to her and her religious beliefs could her sons avoid damnation. The family lived in relative isolation on their farm, with Augusta deliberately choosing this lifestyle to maintain control over her children and protect them from what she saw as the corrupting influences of society. Ed was forbidden from making friends, dating, or engaging in any normal social activities that might expose him to different perspectives or challenge his mother's authority. This isolation would prove crucial in his psychological development, as it prevented him from learning normal social skills or developing healthy relationships with others. Ed's relationship with his father was virtually non-existent, as George was either absent due to his drinking or completely dominated by Augusta when he was present. This lack of a positive male role model left Ed without any counterbalance to his mother's extreme influence and contributed to his confused understanding of gender roles and sexuality. George's weakness and Augusta's dominance created a household dynamic where traditional gender roles were completely inverted, further complicating Ed's psychological development. The economic struggles of the Great Depression forced the family to move several times during Ed's childhood. But Augusta always ensured that they remained isolated from their neighbors and the broader community. She viewed any attempt by outsiders to befriend or help the family as potential threats to her control over her sons, and she actively discouraged any form of social interaction that might challenge her authority or expose her children to different ways of thinking. Augusta's religious teachings were particularly focused on the evils of sexuality and the inherent corruption of the female body. She taught Ed that sexual desire was sinful and that women were dangerous creatures who used their bodies to lead men astray. These teachings, combined with Ed's complete lack of normal social interaction with females, created a deeply disturbed understanding of sexuality that would later manifest in his necrophilic activities and his obsession with the female form. The psychological foundation for Ed's future crimes was laid during these formative years, as Augusta's extreme control, religious fanaticism, and hatred of sexuality combined with social isolation to create a young man who was completely unprepared for normal human relationships and whose understanding of intimacy was fundamentally warped by his mother's twisted worldview. As the first signs, as Ed Gein entered adolescence and young adulthood, the psychological damage inflicted by his mother's extreme control and warped teachings began to manifest in increasingly disturbing ways. Unlike his older brother Henry, who showed some signs of rebellion against Augusta's domination and occasionally questioned her extreme views, Ed remained completely devoted to his mother and absorbed her twisted worldview without question or resistance. During his teenage years, Ed displayed several warning signs that would later be recognized as precursors to his criminal behavior. He showed an unusual fascination with death and anatomy, often spending hours reading medical textbooks and anatomy guides that he found in the local library. His interest in these subjects went beyond normal curiosity, as he would study the illustrations with an intensity that disturbed the few people who observed his behavior. Ed's social development was severely stunted by his mother's isolation tactics and his own psychological dependence on her approval. He had no friends his own age and showed no interest in dating or romantic relationships, which Augusta viewed as confirmation of his moral purity. However, this lack of normal social interaction was actually preventing Ed from developing crucial emotional and psychological skills that would have helped him form healthy relationships later in life. The few neighbors who encountered Ed during this period described him as strange and unsettling, though they couldn't articulate exactly what made them uncomfortable. He had a habit of staring at people, particularly women, with an intensity that made them feel violated and exposed. His conversations were often inappropriate, as he lacked the social skills to understand normal boundaries and frequently made comments about death, religion, or anatomy that left others feeling disturbed. Ed's relationship with his brother Henry began to deteriorate during this period, as Henry started to question their mother's extreme control and express doubts about her teachings. Henry had begun working outside the farm and was exposed to different perspectives that challenged Augusta's worldview. He started to suggest that their mother's influence might be unhealthy and that they should consider living more independent lives. These suggestions from Henry created significant psychological conflict for Ed, who was completely dependent on his mother's approval and couldn't conceive of life without her guidance. Augusta had successfully programmed Ed to view any criticism of her as a form of betrayal and sin, making it impossible for him to consider Henry's concerns objectively. Instead, Ed began to view his brother as a threat to his relationship with his mother and a potential source of corruption. The tension between the brothers came to a head in May 1944, when Henry died under mysterious circumstances during a brush fire on the family property. Ed claimed that he and Henry had been fighting the fire separately and that he had lost track of his brother in the smoke. However, when Henry's body was found, it showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head that were inconsistent with death by smoke inhalation or burns. Although the local authorities ruled Henry's death accidental, many people suspected that Ed had killed his brother to eliminate what he saw as a threat to his relationship with his mother. This incident marked a crucial turning point in Ed's psychological development, as it demonstrated his willingness to use violence to protect his twisted relationship with Augusta and eliminate anyone who might challenge her authority over him. Following Henry's death, Ed's devotion to his mother became even more intense and obsessive. He spent virtually every moment in her presence, catering to her every need and absorbing her teachings with religious fervor. This period of increased isolation and maternal dependence would prove crucial in shaping the psychological framework that would later drive his criminal behavior. The crime, the true extent of Ed Gein's criminal activities began to unfold on November 16, 1957, when local hardware store owner Bernice Warden disappeared from her shop in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Mrs. Warden, a 58-year-old widow who ran the store with her son Frank, was last seen alive when Ed Gein visited the store that morning to purchase antifreeze. When Frank Warden returned to find the store empty, the cash register missing, and a trail of blood leading from behind the counter to the back door, he immediately suspected Gein, who'd been acting strangely in recent weeks and had shown an unusual interest in his mother. The investigation that followed would reveal one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American criminal history. When Winnebago County Sheriff Art Schley and his deputies arrived at Gein's isolated farmhouse that evening, they were unprepared for the horrors they would discover inside. The house had been transformed into a macabre workshop where Gein had been crafting household items and personal accessories from human remains for years. The first discovery was made in Gein's woodshed, where deputies found the decapitated and gutted body of Bernice Warden, hanging upside down from the ceiling like a deer carcass. She had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle, decapitated, and her body had been opened and cleaned in the manner of a butchered animal. The methodical way in which the body had been processed suggested that this was not Gein's first experience with such activities. Inside the farmhouse, investigators discovered a collection of human artifacts that defied comprehension. Gein had fashioned lampshades from human faces, complete with hair and facial features. He had carved bowls and cups from human skulls, created a shoebox containing 9 death masks made from female faces, and fashioned a belt decorated with female nipples. Perhaps most disturbing of all, investigators found a vest made from a woman's torso, complete with breasts, which Gein later admitted to wearing around the house. The investigation revealed that Gein's criminal activities extended far beyond the murder of Bernice Worden. Evidence suggested that he had been robbing graves in local cemeteries for years, exhuming recently buried bodies and bringing them back to his farmhouse to use in his grotesque craft projects. He had a particular preference for middle-aged women who reminded him of his mother, and he would often target graves of women who had died within the previous few days to ensure that the bodies were still relatively fresh. Gein's necrophilic activities were extensive and methodical. He would perform sexual acts with the corpses before dismembering them and using various body parts for his craft projects. He had created an elaborate fantasy world in which he could interact intimately with the female form without the psychological complications that living women represented. This necrophilic behavior was directly connected to his mother's teachings about the evil nature of female sexuality and his own inability to form normal relationships with living women. The second confirmed murder in Gein's case was that of Mary Hogan, a 51-year-old tavern owner who had disappeared from her establishment in December 1954. Investigators found evidence linking Gein to this crime, including personal items belonging to Hogan discovered in his house. Like Bernice Worden, Mary Hogan had been shot, decapitated, and her body processed in the same methodical manner. During his interrogation, Gein confessed to both murders, but claimed that most of his human artifacts had been created from corpses he had stolen from graves rather than people he had killed. He described his grave robbing activities in detail, explaining how he would visit cemeteries at night, dig up recently buried bodies, and transport them back to his farm using a makeshift cart. He admitted to robbing dozens of graves over the course of several years, always targeting female corpses that met his specific psychological criteria. The discovery of Gein's crimes sent shockwaves through the small community of Plainfield and captured national attention. Due to the unprecedented nature of his activities, the case challenged law enforcement's understanding of criminal behavior and introduced the American public to concepts of necrophilia, grave robbing, and psychological deviance that had previously been confined to academic and medical circles. The reaction. The discovery of Ed Gein's crimes on November 16, 1957, sent unprecedented shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community of Plainfield, Wisconsin, where residents struggled to comprehend how their quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been living such a horrific double life for years. The revelation that Gein had been robbing graves, committing necrophilia, and crafting household items from human remains challenged everything the community thought they knew about evil and mental illness. Initial reactions from Plainfield residents ranged from disbelief to horror to morbid fascination. Many neighbors who had known Gein for years found it impossible to reconcile the quiet, odd handyman they remembered with the monster revealed by the investigation. Mrs. Irene Hill, who lived near the Gein farm, told reporters, "He was always strange, but we never imagined anything like this. He seemed harmless, just peculiar. How could we have known what he was doing in that house?" The local media coverage was initially restrained, as journalists struggled to find appropriate language to describe Gein's crimes without sensationalizing the horrific details. However, as news of the case spread beyond Wisconsin, national media outlets began arriving in Plainfield, transforming the quiet farming community into a circus of reporters, photographers, and curiosity seekers. The small town was completely unprepared for this level of attention, and many residents felt violated by the media invasion. The psychological impact on the community was profound and long-lasting. Parents became fearful for their children's safety, even though Gein had never shown any interest in harming children. The knowledge that someone could live among them for years while engaging in such disturbing activities created a sense of paranoia and mistrust that would persist for decades. Many residents reported having nightmares and experiencing anxiety about their own safety. If this story has captured your attention, don't forget to like this video and share it with others who are fascinated by true crime psychology, because the investigation that followed would reveal insights into human behavior that continue to influence criminal psychology today. The religious community in Plainfield was particularly shaken by Gein's crimes, as many residents had known Augusta Gein and were aware of her extreme religious views. The revelation that such fanatical religious devotion had produced a son capable of such horrific acts challenged many people's understanding of faith and morality. Local ministers struggled to address their congregations' questions about how such evil could emerge from what appeared to be a deeply religious household. Law enforcement officials were equally unprepared for the scope and nature of Gein's crimes. Sheriff Art Schley, who led the initial investigation, later admitted that nothing in his experience had prepared him for what they found in Gein's house. The deputies who processed the crime scene required psychological counseling, and several officers requested transfers to other departments because they couldn't cope with the images and memories from the investigation. The medical and psychiatric communities reacted with intense interest to Gein's case, recognizing it as an unprecedented opportunity to study severe psychological deviance and its relationship to childhood trauma. Dr. Edward Kelleher, who conducted Gein's initial psychiatric evaluation, described the case as unlike anything in the psychiatric literature, and noted that Gein's combination of necrophilia, grave robbing, and maternal fixation represented a unique form of psychological dysfunction. The case also had a significant impact on popular culture, inspiring numerous books, films, and academic studies. The horrific details of Gein's crimes captured the public imagination in a way that few criminal cases had before, leading to a fascination with psychological horror that would influence American entertainment for decades to come at our families of Gein's victims and the people whose graves he had robbed faced additional trauma as they learned the extent of his activities. Many families were forced to exhume and rebury their loved ones after learning that Gein had violated their graves, adding another layer of grief and violation to their loss. The reaction to Gein's crimes also highlighted the inadequacy of mental health resources in rural communities during the 1950s. Many experts noted that Gein's obvious psychological problems had gone unaddressed for years, partly because of the stigma surrounding mental illness and the lack of available treatment options in small towns like Plainfield. The investigation into Ed Gein's crimes began as a straightforward missing person case, but quickly evolved into one of the most complex and disturbing criminal investigations in American history. When Bernice Worden disappeared from her hardware store on November 16, 1957, her son Frank immediately suspected Gein, who had been acting strangely and had shown unusual interest in the store's operations and his mother's schedule. Sheriff Art Schley and his team initially approached the investigation as a potential robbery-murder case, but they were completely unprepared for what they would discover at Gein's isolated farmhouse. The first search of the property revealed not only evidence of Bernice Worden's murder, but also a collection of human artifacts that suggested years of criminal activity involving grave robbing, necrophilia, and the systematic desecration of human remains. The forensic investigation was complicated by the primitive state of crime scene analysis in the 1950s. DNA testing was decades away, and investigators had to rely on traditional methods of evidence collection and analysis. However, the sheer volume of physical evidence at Gein's property made it possible to piece together a comprehensive picture of his criminal activities over several years. Investigators catalogued hundreds of items made from human remains, including furniture, clothing, household objects, and decorative items. Each artifact had to be carefully documented and analyzed to determine its origin and the methods used in its creation. The meticulous nature of Gein's work suggested that he had been perfecting his techniques over many years and had developed a systematic approach to processing human remains. The investigation team worked closely with local cemetery officials to identify which graves had been disturbed by Gein's nocturnal activities. Records showed that dozens of graves in 3 different cemeteries had been robbed over the course of several years, with Gein targeting recently buried middle-aged women who fit his psychological profile. The pattern of grave robberies helped investigators understand the scope of Gein's activities and provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. Dr. Edward Kelleher, a psychiatrist from the Mendota State Hospital, was brought in to conduct a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Gein. This evaluation was crucial not only for determining Gein's mental state at the time of his crimes, but also for understanding the psychological factors that had driven his behavior. Dr. Kelleher's interviews with Gein revealed the extent of his delusions and the complex relationship between his crimes and his psychological fixation on his deceased mother. The investigation also involved extensive interviews with Plainfield residents who had known Gein over the years. These interviews revealed a pattern of increasingly strange behavior that had been dismissed or ignored by the community. Neighbors reported that Gein had made inappropriate comments about death and anatomy, had shown unusual interest in recent obituaries, and had been seen near cemeteries at odd hours. One of the most challenging aspects of the investigation was determining the full extent of Gein's criminal activities. While he confessed to the murders of Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan, investigators suspected that he might have been responsible for other disappearances in the area. However, the lack of physical evidence and Gein's own confused mental state made it difficult to establish definitive links to other potential crimes. The investigation team also had to address the psychological impact of the case on themselves and the broader community. The horrific nature of Gein's crimes and the disturbing crime scene took a significant toll on the investigators, several of whom required counseling and support to cope with what they had witnessed. Forensic experts from the University of Wisconsin were consulted to help analyze the human artifacts found in Gein's house. These experts provided crucial insights into Gein's methods and helped investigators understand the timeline of his criminal activities. The analysis revealed that Gein had been engaging in these activities for at least 4 years, and possibly longer. The investigation ultimately established that Gein had committed 2 murders, robbed dozens of graves, and engaged in extensive necrophilic activities over several years. The comprehensive nature of the investigation provided law enforcement with unprecedented insights into the psychology of extreme criminal behavior and established new protocols for investigating similar cases in the future. The judgment. The legal proceedings in the Ed Gein case presented unprecedented challenges for the Wisconsin criminal justice system, as courts struggled to address crimes that defied conventional understanding and legal precedent. The case raised fundamental questions about criminal responsibility, mental illness, and the appropriate response to behavior that was clearly both criminal and deeply pathological. Gein was initially charged with first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Warden, but the complexity of his psychological condition immediately became a central issue in the legal proceedings. His bizarre behavior during police interrogations and his apparent disconnection from reality raised serious questions about his competency to stand trial and his mental state at the time of his crimes. The preliminary psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. Edward Kelleher, concluded that Gein was suffering from severe mental illness and was not competent to stand trial. Dr. Kelleher diagnosed Gein with schizophrenia and noted that his grasp on reality was so tenuous that he could not understand the charges against him or assist in his own defense. This finding led to Gein being committed to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane in Waupun, Wisconsin. The competency hearing revealed the full extent of Gein's psychological dysfunction. Expert witnesses testified about his delusional thinking, his inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, and his complete lack of understanding about the moral and legal implications of his actions. Gein's own testimony during the hearing was rambling and incoherent, filled with references to his mother and bizarre justifications for his behavior. The prosecution faced the difficult task of seeking justice for Gein's victims while acknowledging the reality of his severe mental illness. District Attorney Earl Kylene argued that regardless of Gein's mental state, he had committed heinous crimes that demanded accountability. However, the overwhelming evidence of Gein's psychological dysfunction made it clear that traditional criminal proceedings would be inappropriate. The defense, led by court-appointed attorney William Belter, focused on demonstrating the extent of Gein's mental illness and arguing that he was not responsible for his actions due to his psychological condition. The defense presented extensive psychiatric testimony about the relationship between Gein's childhood trauma, his mother's psychological abuse, and the development of his criminal behavior. After spending 10 years in the state hospital, Gein was finally deemed competent to stand trial in 1968. However, by this time, the legal landscape had changed significantly, and there was greater understanding of the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. The prosecution decided to proceed with a single charge of first-degree murder in the death of Bernice Worden. While other potential charges were dropped, the 1968 trial was relatively brief, as Gein's guilt was not in dispute. The central question was whether he was legally insane at the time of the crime. The defense presented compelling evidence of Gein's severe mental illness, including detailed psychiatric evaluations and testimony about his delusional thinking and complete disconnection from reality. The prosecution acknowledged Gein's mental illness, but argued that he had shown some awareness of the wrongfulness of his actions by attempting to conceal his crimes and lying to investigators. However, the overwhelming evidence of his psychological dysfunction made this argument difficult to sustain. On November 14, 1968, Judge Robert H. Golmar found Gein guilty of first-degree murder, but ruled that he was criminally insane at the time of the crime. This verdict meant that Gein would be committed to a mental health facility rather than sentenced to prison or death. The judge noted that Gein's crimes were the product of a diseased mind, and that traditional criminal punishment would serve no useful purpose. The verdict was generally accepted by the community and legal experts, who recognized that Gein's case represented a clear example of criminal behavior driven by severe mental illness. The ruling established important precedents for handling similar cases and contributed to evolving understanding of the relationship between mental health and criminal responsibility. Gein was returned to the Central State Hospital, where he would spend the remainder of his life under psychiatric care. The legal proceedings had taken over a decade to resolve, but they ultimately provided a framework for addressing similar cases in the future and contributed to important developments in criminal law and forensic psychiatry, prison, and reflection following his conviction and commitment to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Ed Gein entered a new phase of his life that would last for the next 16 years until his death in 1984. The transition from his isolated farmhouse to the structured environment of a psychiatric facility represented a dramatic change for a man who had spent most of his adult life living in complete social isolation with only his psychological delusions for Hospital staff described Gein as a model patient who adapted well to institutional life, perhaps finding comfort in the structured routine and constant supervision that replaced the chaotic internal world he had inhabited for so many years. He was generally cooperative with staff and other patients, showing little of the aggressive or violent behavior that might have been expected from someone who had committed such horrific crimes. Dr. E.F. Schubert, who supervised Gein's treatment at the hospital, noted that his patient showed significant improvement once he was removed from the environment that had fostered his delusions and criminal behavior. Away from his mother's house and the artifacts he had created from human remains, Gein began to demonstrate a clearer understanding of reality and showed some recognition of the wrongfulness of his actions. However, Gein's psychological recovery was limited by the severity of his underlying mental illness and the deeply ingrained patterns of thinking that had developed over decades of isolation and maternal domination. While he could function adequately in the hospital environment, he never fully grasped the magnitude of his crimes or developed genuine empathy for his victims and their families. During his years in the hospital, Gein participated in various therapeutic activities and occupational therapy programs. He showed particular skill in crafts and woodworking, though hospital staff were careful to monitor his activities and ensure that he had no access to materials that might trigger memories of his criminal behavior. His artistic abilities, which had been so grotesquely misdirected in his crimes, were channeled into more appropriate outlets. Gein's relationship with his family was virtually non-existent during his hospitalization. He had no surviving immediate family members, and the few distant relatives who remained wanted nothing to do with him. This isolation was perhaps beneficial for his treatment, as it removed him from the family dynamics that had contributed to his psychological dysfunction. The psychiatric staff who worked with Gein over the years provided valuable insights into his psychological condition and the factors that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Their observations and treatment notes became important resources for researchers studying the relationship between childhood trauma, maternal domination, and the development of severe psychological disorders. Subscribe to this channel if you want to explore more cases that delve into the psychology of killers, because understanding the mind behind the crime is often more disturbing than the crime itself. One of the most significant aspects of Gein's hospitalization was his gradual acknowledgement of the reality of his crimes. While he never fully understood the impact of his actions on others, he did begin to recognize that his behavior had been wrong and that his perceptions of reality had been severely distorted. This limited insight represented significant progress for someone who had been completely delusional for so many years. Gein's physical health began to decline in the early 1980s, and he developed respiratory problems that would eventually prove fatal. Despite his crimes, hospital staff treated him with compassion and provided appropriate medical care during his final years. His death on July 26, 1984, from respiratory failure marked the end of one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American history. The legacy of Gein's time in the hospital extended far beyond his individual case, as his treatment provided valuable insights for forensic psychiatry and contributed to better understanding of how to manage patients who have committed crimes while suffering from severe mental illness. The mind of the criminal, the psychological profile of Ed Gein, represents one of the most complex and disturbing cases in the annals of criminal psychology, revealing how extreme childhood trauma, maternal domination, and social isolation can combine to create a mind capable of unimaginable acts of depravity. Unlike typical serial killers who are motivated by power, control, or sexual gratification, Gein's crimes were driven by a unique combination of psychological factors that created a completely distorted understanding of human relationships, sexuality, and death. Dr. Edward Kelleher's comprehensive psychiatric evaluation of Gein identified several key psychological factors that contributed to his criminal behavior. The most significant was the extreme maternal domination he experienced throughout his childhood and early adulthood, which prevented him from developing a normal understanding of gender roles, sexuality, and human relationships. Augusta Gein's fanatical religious beliefs and pathological hatred of female sexuality created a psychological framework in which Gein could only relate to women as objects of fear, fascination, and ultimately possession. The concept of maternal transference is crucial to understanding Gein's psychology. His crimes were not random acts of violence, but rather desperate attempts to maintain a connection with his deceased mother through the possession and manipulation of female bodies. The artifacts he created from human remains served as transitional objects that allowed him to feel close to his mother while simultaneously expressing his confused and repressed sexuality. Gein's necrophilic behavior was directly connected to his inability to form normal relationships with living women. His mother's teachings had convinced him that all women were evil and dangerous, making it psychologically impossible for him to approach living females in a normal manner. Corpses, however, represented the perfect solution to his psychological dilemma. They were female forms that could not reject him, judge him, or threaten his psychological equilibrium. The psychological evaluation revealed that Gein suffered from multiple mental disorders, including schizophrenia, severe personality disorders, and various paraphilias. However, his case was unique because these conditions were so intertwined with his specific family dynamics and childhood experiences that they created a completely novel form of psychological dysfunction that had never been documented in psychiatric literature. Gein's relationship with reality was severely compromised by years of social isolation and his mother's psychological manipulation. He lived in a fantasy world where the boundaries between life and death, self and other, and reality and delusion were completely blurred. His crimes were not calculated acts of evil, but rather the logical extension of a completely distorted worldview that had been shaped by decades of psychological abuse and isolation. The role of sexual repression in Gein's psychology cannot be overstated. His mother's teachings about the evil nature of sexuality, combined with his complete lack of normal social interaction, created a psychological pressure cooker that eventually exploded in the form of his necrophilic activities. His crimes represented a twisted attempt to explore and express his sexuality in the only way his damaged psyche could conceive: forensic. Psychologists have noted that Gein's case demonstrates the extreme importance of early childhood experiences in shaping adult behavior. The combination of maternal domination, religious fanaticism, social isolation, and sexual repression created a perfect storm of psychological dysfunction that made his criminal behavior almost inevitable. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Gein derived genuine satisfaction from his crimes, not from causing pain or death, but from the sense of intimacy and connection he felt with his victims' remains. His careful preservation and use of human body parts reflected a deeply disturbed understanding of love and relationships that had been warped by his mother's psychological abuse. The case of Ed Gein demonstrates how childhood trauma and psychological abuse can create individuals whose understanding of human relationships is so fundamentally distorted that they become capable of acts that defy normal comprehension. His story serves as a chilling reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing psychological dysfunction before it manifests in criminal behavior. Mysterious and reflective conclusion. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died quietly in his sleep at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, bringing to an end one of the most psychologically complex and disturbing criminal cases in American history. His death from respiratory failure marked the conclusion of a life that had been defined by extreme psychological dysfunction, horrific crimes, and the complete breakdown of normal human relationships and understanding. Gein's death was met with little fanfare or public attention, a stark contrast to the media circus that had surrounded his arrest and trial nearly 3 decades earlier. By 1984, he had become a largely forgotten figure, known primarily to researchers, criminologists, and horror enthusiasts who continued to study his case and its influence on popular culture. The man who had once shocked the nation with his grotesque crimes had faded into obscurity, spending his final years as a quiet, elderly patient in a psychiatric facility. The question of what to do with Gein's remains presented a final challenge for authorities, who were concerned about preventing his grave from becoming a macabre tourist attraction or shrine for those fascinated by his crimes. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, ensuring that there would be no physical memorial to mark his existence or provide a focal point for morbid curiosity. The psychological questions surrounding Gein's case remain as compelling today as they were during his lifetime. How does a human being become capable of such systematic desecration of human remains? What combination of factors, psychological, social, and environmental, creates a mind so fundamentally disconnected from normal human empathy and understanding? The answers lie in the complex intersection of childhood trauma, maternal domination, social isolation, and severe mental illness that characterized his life. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Gein case is how it forces us to confront the fragility of human psychology and the devastating impact that childhood trauma can have on adult behavior. Unlike fictional monsters or supernatural villains, Gein was undeniably human, a product of specific circumstances and experiences that shaped his development in the most horrific ways possible. His case serves as a chilling reminder that the capacity for extreme deviance exists within the realm of human possibility. The legacy of Ed Gein extends far beyond his individual crimes, influencing everything from criminal psychology research to popular entertainment. His case provided crucial insights into the relationship between childhood trauma and adult criminality, contributing to better understanding of how psychological dysfunction develops and manifests in criminal behavior. These insights have informed modern approaches to mental health treatment and criminal justice, helping to prevent similar cases from developing. The families of Gein's victims and the people whose graves he violated continue to live with the consequences of his actions long after his death. Many struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones had been desecrated and used in Gein's grotesque craft projects, adding another layer of trauma to their grief. The violation of death itself, the ultimate boundary of human experience, created a form of trauma that was difficult to process or overcome. In the end, Ed Gein remains a dark enigma wrapped in the mundane facade of a Wisconsin farmer. He was neither the obvious monster that popular culture often portrays criminals to be, nor the product of a single traumatic event that might explain his transformation. He was something far more disturbing, a reminder that the human mind, when subjected to extreme trauma and isolation, can develop in ways that defy our understanding of normal behavior and morality. The question that haunts those who study his case is not just how he committed such horrific acts, but how he was able to live with himself while doing so. The answer may lie in the possibility that for Gein, his crimes were not acts of evil, but expressions of love and devotion to his deceased mother. In his twisted worldview, the creation of artifacts from human remains was a form of art and worship that honored the female form, while allowing him to maintain his psychological connection to the most important person in his life. This fundamental misunderstanding of human relationships and the nature of love and death reveals the true horror of the Gein case. It suggests that the most dangerous individuals may not be those who know they are doing evil, but those whose understanding of reality is so distorted that they genuinely believe their actions are justified or even virtuous. The farmhouse where Gein committed his crimes was eventually demolished, and the land returned to agricultural use. But for those who remember, the legacy of what happened there serves as a permanent reminder of the darkest possibilities of human psychology and the importance of recognizing and addressing mental illness before it manifests in such devastating ways. If this story has intrigued you, subscribe to this channel to explore other real crimes that shocked the world and the minds behind them.